Do we sing, really? Do you really think that we sing to cause God to think something about us they wouldn't have thought otherwise? This is hard stuff, isn't it? It's tough stuff. But I would submit to you that a lot of us, your pastor included, still wrestles with that mindset. Man, I better earn God's good favor today. I mean, when you feel like that God has his arms folded, until you say that, by the way, Lisa and I have long talks about this. We are not going to let our children believe that they are disliked by God until they pray a magic prayer and then they're liked by God. They start here. From day one, when they get teaching at this church, they are told from day one, God is eating up with you. God loves you, and maybe on your worst days was when he loves you the best. We are not going to let your kids or my kids grow up somehow believing that they can change God's mind about them. By the way, God's mind about you, you've heard this before. If you haven't, then either you're new, you haven't been listening, all right? So you may want to write this down if that's you, all right? God's mind about you, his disposition towards you, God's mind and his heart about you is fixed. His mind is made up about you. His disposition toward you has already been fixed. And the news is really good. But when you don't live there, when you live in fear of that condemnation, right? When you live in fear that you won't ultimately, through your life, live up to the right standards, then life is lived with this cloud over your head. You ever felt that guilt cloud? People who have grown up in the church? Ever? Have you ever lived in fear of your eternity? Have I done enough? And it's not just the fear of your eternity, is it? It's the guilt that you can kind of carry around today. I haven't been good enough today. Now look, maybe you haven't, and maybe you do need to get better. But your getting better still doesn't change God's mind about you. Yeah, but John, I'm pretty sure that something pretty significant happened on that cross, and it looks like God unleashes something. Oh, I think you're right. Here's what happens on the cross. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh, my Sunday school class talked about this today. This Jesus that we talk about was absolutely and fully human and was placed on a very real cross. But God does not persecute or prosecute Jesus on the cross. It's not that Christ is on trial before God on the cross. Sin is on trial before God on the cross. That's huge. That is huge. And this is who we are as a tradition. Everybody hear this? The way of life that Paul has been calling the life of sin and death. That way of life. That way of life that is so bent towards self-preservation. That way of life that even sometimes in religious circles is bent towards self-preservation, right? That way of life, sin and death, it's that way of life that is on trial in the cross. And before God, here's what happens to this whole sin and death thing. Sin and resulting death is tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed.